Hello and welcome to The Spark. I'm Matt, and by the grace of the Nashville Public Library, I'm here to talk about the creative process and the joy of appreciating the creations of others. Thankfully, I'm not going to do it alone. Joining me today is an associate curator from the Frist Art Museum. His most recent efforts are two connected exhibits, David C. Driskell Friends, Creativity, Collaboration, and Friendship, and Kindred Spirits, Intergenerational Forms of Expression, 1966 to 1999, which are on display until June 1st of 2025. It's Michael J. Ewing. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm good, man.
Thanks for coming on.
Man, thank you for having me.
So how does it feel now that the exhibits are finally up? At time of recording, they've been up for a few days at this point.
Yes, man. It feels wonderful. I think it's interesting, right? When you, as a curator, I think, or as any creative, there's this kind of beauty of the process. And even when, the show debuts, there's a sort of sadness because, you lose that kind of, that moment where you're still working on it. And so there's this joy, of course, because the world gets to experience it, the Nashville community. But then you're like, man, you're not researching the artist or you're not doing certain things anymore. So there's a kind of shift talking about the show, promoting the show. So now I'm in that space, that headspace now.
Yeah, doing the press tour. So to that point, I think curation, specifically at a museum space, or I guess any space, feels like a very sort of removed from the public eye type role. And you talk about artist research and things of that nature. What does curation look like day to day?
That's a great question. I think that, to your point, there's so much of the curatorial process that the general public or the audience never sees.
Sure.
And I think it starts with the idea. Like what is, in our interpretation meetings at the Frist, we talk about this, what's the big idea? And so for me, it starts with a big idea around this curiosity. For this particular exhibition, David C. Driskell Friends was already kind of a developed show. And so my chief curator, Mark Scala, when I got hired, I started in January of 2024. He asked me, do you want to create a companion show? And sometimes we have that unique possibility. So basically we have exhibitions, upper level gallery spaces, 6,000 square feet. And sometimes you'll have an exhibition where the artwork may not fulfill the entire space. And with the exhibition designer, you can do something really beautiful. But here was a great opportunity, right, to say, how did this show in particular, right, how can a companion show really add to telling the story? And then not only being able to do a companion show in this curatorial process, but to partner with another neighboring institution was like a really great kind of opportunity. And so I think it really started with, here's an already complete story of David Driskell and these tremendous artists that he's working with. But then because David Driskell spent 10 years in Nashville, how could we tell a story particular that's site-specific to his time in this city and the impact in this city? And so that really started the curatorial process. And so that was kind of what led me to start thinking about what are the direct connections between Driskell as an artist, as a scholar, as a visionary, and Nashville specifically. And so I think that kind of, as you talk about, the curatorial process, for me, to kind of hone it in, it was really how, as a curator, can I amplify and expand the conversation of an exhibition by creating a new exhibition that explores similar themes, but also themes that are really Southern and Nashville rooted.
Yeah, and the other local institution with the connection to this exhibition being Fisk.
Yes, so Fisk University, my alma mater. So I graduated from Fisk University in 2013. With my degree in art and psychology, and I worked at Fisk in the art gallery from 2017 to 2019. And so as the gallery coordinator. So it also was an opportunity that a lot of the works that are in the exhibition are works that I've researched, works that I've had to move and to kind of, live with in a way, because a part of my job was working in collections management. So I was working within the collection. So I knew the collection really well, but this offered an opportunity to kind of pull some of those works out of that collection and really tell the stories around them,
So the museum, or is it a museum at Fisk?
A gallery.
Gallery.
Yeah.
For the benefit of the audience, what is the distinction?
The gallery, of course, I think more kind of in its function. The Carl Van Vechten Gallery is famously known in Nashville for housing the Alfred Stieglitz collection. Alfred Stieglitz was a pioneering curator, artist, and his wife, George O'Keeffe, in 1949, donated 101 works to Fisk University as a part of the collection. And so the gallery kind of stands as, which is an interesting story. Carl Van Vechten Gallery before was actually a gymnasium. So if you ever get a chance to check out the gallery, it was one of the first gymnasiums. And so I would say in function, the gallery, it's really kind of more kind of a language thing, right? Like, so a museum, when I think about a museum, I think about many times a collection, which is interesting about the Frist is they're a non-collecting museum. But a gallery, I think maybe just more because of its size, right? The gallery isn't more than 5,000 square feet. And so I do think in the future it may shift into a museum. I think that's in the vision of the director, Jamal Sheets.
Cool.
But, my background, I worked in commercial galleries, and many times commercial galleries are galleries where things are kind of for sale, and you have exhibitions that usually shift every month, and sometimes they're more in the commercial space. But what you find is that particularly with higher education institutions, you have galleries connected to them as a space to display and exhibit works, many times of students, of the permanent collection, or of traveling exhibitions that come to that institution.
So talking about the research for these exhibits, or particularly your companion exhibit to David C. Driskell, what sort of resources are you using? Like, where are you looking to research? And I assume that's very specific to the individual project.
I'm glad you asked that, because I think there's two. One is David Driskell was an incredible archivist. So he was impeccable about keeping records. And for the general public to know is David Driskell was in Nashville from 1966 to 1976. So one of the first things I think with the research or with a lot of exhibitions is you want to establish a timeline, right? And so the timeline we wanted to establish, myself and Jamal Sheets, who's the director of the gallery and curator, was 1966 we thought is a really interesting timeline because that's when Driskell arrives to Nashville, right? And it's from 1966 to 1976. And then there's another incredible artist named Earl J. Hooks, who both him and David Driskell went to Howard at different periods, but were friends for many years. And David Driskell would invite him to come teach at Fisk from 1968 until 1999.
Okay.
And so one of the ideas that we had was, let's tell a robust story, not just of the 10 years, right? We knew that 10 year would be really great from 66 to 76. But let's also kind of have kind of a beautiful ending point in 1999, which is the year that Earl Hooks, who's one of the kind of prominent artists within the exhibition, is retiring from Fisk University and working in the art department. And so going back to your research question, by kind of building out a timeline, that allowed us to look at what exhibitions are happening in that time, right? And so one of the main parameters of this exhibition was either it was a artist who graduated from Fisk University, who studied at Fisk University, an artist who exhibited at Fisk University, or maybe was an artist in resident. So every artist in Kindred Spirits literally has a tie to Nashville in a particular way, in a particular time period between that 1966 and 1999. And just to tell you how much on the nose it is one of the main artists who I want to champion is a local artist in Nashville. Her name is LaFran Ford. She graduated from Fisk in 1966, right? She studies under Aaron Douglas. For those who don't know, Aaron Douglas is a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He starts the art department at Fisk University, right? And he retires in 1966. The other really interesting point when you talk about research is Fisk was founded in 1866. So 1966 would be the centennial year of the institution, and Fisk University being the oldest institution in Nashville of higher learning. And so we knew that centennial year was like really great to kind of be a launching pad because you had 66. But again, you have LaFran Ford who graduates in 1966. And then this year, she is celebrating. She came onto staff at the art department later in '85. This year, she's celebrating 40 years as an art professor at Fisk. So she's the longest tenured professor in the history of the institution, right? But then you have someone like Alicia Henry, who was a mentor of mine who recently transitioned, and her work in the show is from 1999, right? So she comes, I believe, around the late to mid 90s, and she's there until her recent passing last year in 2004. And so, in 2024. And so the years really play a kind of a critical role in the show because they become like these kind of entryways to kind of talk about the story, right? So the other interesting part is Alicia Henry, whose work is in the show in the presentation at Fisk from 99, she's born in 1966, right? Which is kind of interesting to me for people who love numbers. She's born in 1966. And those two artists that I just mentioned, both LaFran Fort and Alicia Henry, were next door neighbors for 20 years. Right. And so what Kindred Spirits was really about, kind of going back to your research question, was one, you have kind of documented record, right? You have catalogs that I'm looking at in special collections, so I have a deep affinity. I'm glad that we're in the library because I have a deep affinity for libraries, in particular special collections, because that is where I'm doing some initial research of looking at these catalogs and seeing catalog pamphlets for these artists that exhibited throughout these years. But the other really critical part about it was oral tradition. I think when you talk about kind of the artistic, particularly the African American community, those oral stories are so important. So a big way that myself and Jamal were able to curate this exhibition was to really ask questions. So I asked curators like Victor Simmons, who was there, 10 years ago, Robert Hall, who was the curator and graduated from Fisk 20, 30 years ago, right? And so it was really collecting these stories as a primary resource and looking at how do we look at the oral tradition as its primary resource as a way to research. And so you start to find, as you go through the exhibition and read some of the labels, you find these kind of like unique relationships and kinships between the artists and between, how they're working with one another that you only could really find out unless you kind of knew those stories. And so I think that was a really important part of the research is one, kind of your traditional research and that has kind of the academic background, right, their biographical background. But the kindredness in this exhibition is really kind of telling those intangible and sometimes those stories that live outside of any textbook or any catalog.
So talking about Fisk being your alma mater, you're originally from Houston?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Houston, Texas. Interesting story. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and my brother graduated from Fisk as well. So I graduated in 2013. My brother graduated in 2009. And when I was in the 11th grade or 12th grade, I came to Fisk to see him during the Spring Arts Festival, which is a kind of a festive time on Fisk campus. Every spring, art exhibitions and usually some type of a play of a sort. And he was in a play called A Lesson Before Dying.
Okay.
And I remember coming to Fisk, and I knew that this was the institution I wanted to come to. And so it was really the arts that brought me here. So yeah, that was a beautiful draw there. So even when I talk about this idea of kindredness, is that my older brother went to Fisk. He was his degree is in art and sociology, and my degree is art and psychology. And so we took some of the same professors.
Yeah.
We studied under some of the various same artists. And so when I'm talking about this idea of kindredness, it's also from a very personal aspect of being able to, if you have an older sibling that you never quite old enough that y'all could be in school together. So when I was a freshman, he was a senior. So we had that 1 year together, and it was just really impactful. Since then, kind of Nashville has been my home off and on since 2009 when I arrived.
Nice. So going for a art and psychology degree and having spent some time in commercial galleries in the interim, was curation your focus? Was the making of art a focus?
So it's interesting, right? I spoke before. One of the reasons I speak about Alicia Henry so highly. So I originally was a dramatics and speech major, which was kind of Fisk's way of saying communications. So I actually wanted to go into journalism as one of I've always been curious about people and always been curious about the world. And so that was also kind of how I got into psychology. So long story short, the department was no longer in function. And because my credits in dramatics and speech fell under kind of the art category, I shifted to an art major. And I had started taking psychology classes, again, just in my deep curiosity. And my advisor was like, Mike, if you take, 3 or 4 more classes, you could be a double major. And so art became that. But I remember it was a studio painting class that I had with Alicia Henry, and I write about this in a catalog for a show coming up. And I would find myself at all of my classmates' canvas, talking to them about their art, thinking about their art, asking them about themselves. And one day Alicia Henry asked me, she said, have you ever considered being a curator? And it was something that never crossed my mind. In true honesty, I didn't really understand the weight or even the function of a curator, because as we talked about before, most of what a curator does, the public may not see. And so the next semester, she had a class called Arts and Ideas that she told me to sign up for. In that class particularly, the students had to be student curators to curate an art show that would debut at the Spring Arts Festival. And so ever since I took that class, I knew that changed the trajectory of my career.
Yeah.
I knew that, one, it allowed me to be deeply curious. It allowed me to build, sort of like journalism, tell that kind of storytelling in a beautiful way, but it allowed me to work with artists and amplify their voices and kind of manipulate environments. Because I believe when you think about a curator, we're manipulating space to evoke these certain emotions, to kind of build this story or to kind of push this big idea. And so curation encompassed all of the things that I really wanted to kind of engage with, and all of my curiosities and the ways I wanted to invoke people's sensibilities. And so that's what landed me at curation.
That's really cool. Yeah, and that's part of why in the sort of setup for this show, I've tried to make it, as in the intro, both about the making of things, but also the appreciating of things that are already made. Because it sounds like the way you're talking about curation exists on a sort of similar axis to critique, when critique is being used to either elevate a form, an art form, or a specific piece of art.
Yeah.
In curation in general, in the classes you're talking about, or in the times you've spent curating professionally since, is there a desire or something ingrained in the practice of curation that you are trying to be sort of behind the scenes in that elevation, like to not be visible as a curator as opposed to making the art visible?
One, I think that was a really beautiful way to kind of talk about, you talked about that axis of, I think a curator, what you find many times, it's interesting, right? When you think about curation, some people approach curation from a background in art history. So they're looking at it from a very historical lens. And so part of what they're thinking about with their practice is contextualizing the work within the larger art canons, right? That's part of how I navigate. But as we spoke about before, my background being in psychology, I want to think about kind of the cognitive framework of how art can impact people, right? And so the power in a great curator is when you're able to really make the story come through. Like, you are able to connect what the artist is intending to say to the audience, and you are the bridge between the work that has been done on the canvas or whatever medium they're working in, and then translating that or creating an environment that best translate that to a larger audience. And so it's interesting because when you think about, in some cases, if I'm correct, I might have to stay corrected, but I remember researching, I'm really big into etymology, and the word curator in defined is one who maintains a collection, right? But also one of the root words of it is curas. And I remember reading that when it's kind of like the protector of spirit, right? And so what I'm wanting to do as a curator is not so much protect the spirit of the artist, but honor the spirit of what the artist is wanting to do. So I'm never trying to fit art into a theme that it doesn't fit into. I'm not trying to curate work in a way that isn't where the artist intended it to live and how it is displayed. But at the same time, curation also gives you ability to cross-pollinate these ideas and to show work in a way that people may not see in a certain category or a certain perspective, right? You may not think about this work. I'll give you a perfect example. There's an artist in the show. His name is James Miles. He's since now transitioned. But James Miles was a sculptor, painter, but by trade, he was a barber, right? And there's these two beautiful busts that you'll see. One of Aaron Douglas that he did in 1974 as his senior project, and one later in 1998 that he does of David Driskell. And as I started to research James Miles, he was a very quiet man. He went on record times talking about how his work speaks for itself. But there was this interesting part in his life where he talked about how in an interview that as a barber, he had the access to people's anatomy. So when you're sitting in a chair, he would say, your nose or your ear may end up in one of his sculptures, right? Because if you think about it, right, he has this kind of time, 30 to 45 minutes with each client that sits in his chair, and he's really kind of studying their anatomy as he's kind of, cutting their hair. And so I thought about that, really interesting to think about this idea of, yes, I could talk about him as an artist, but also what about talking about how this barbering, which we already think about this as this kind of social practice, a barber shop being this place we gather, right? This space that, this kind of safe space for men or women to come and kind of exchange, but also in many ways, his practice that's actually informing his studio practice. And so as a curator, it's like, what story do you tell? Do I just talk about him as a sculptor? Or do I also talk about this kind of intersection of how his work as a barber is informing what he's doing in his practice? And so that's just one example of kind of, I think one of the honors of being a curator is like really kind of finding those interesting through lines in people's story or their narrative and then bringing that to the audience. And so then how do people think about when they sit in a barber chair differently, right? How do barbers or think about this idea of how their hands in many ways or in some ways sculpting as well? Because when the client sits down in a chair, they look one way. There's an artistic process that's happening that when they leave that chair, they're leaving with a different level of confidence. And visually, there's a change in that.
Yeah. Art being like the practice of transformation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I've never considered this before, but this is really neat. Talking about the idea of taking pieces of art and looking at them through different lenses, and the idea of curation being on a similar axis to critique. My background is English. I have an English degree. And any English degree, you're writing a lot of critical papers.
Right.
And there are a specific sort of set of critical theories that are typically used to examine pieces of literature, whether written or otherwise. And whether that is what you're talking about with art history folks. In literary critique, we would call that cultural poetics, where you take like the context of the time a thing was written, who wrote it, where they were, that sort of thing. But then you have things like feminist theory, Marxist theory, queer theory. Talking about how a lot of people come at it from an art history perspective and using those contexts now as you are crafting. Was there in your training any incentivizing or encouraging to be like, now try and make a collection of things around this kind of idea or this kind of idea, like breaking you out of just using historical context or things of that nature?
That's a big part of, right, particularly when you're talking sometimes around African-American artists or artists in the African diaspora that aren't always recognized within the canon, is that you are doing kind of this work of recontextualizing. Right, so there's a section in the show at the iteration of the Frist called Schools of Color and Abstract Expressions, right? And I could have said the Washington Color School and Abstract Expressionism, right, which these artists are working within. What I want to do kind of in the poetics of the language, right, is Schools of Color was this idea of, yes, there's a Washington Color School in a particular style and how artists approach this, but there are artists that are kind of creating their own schools of thoughts. So you have Kenneth Victor Young, artists like Alma Thomas, who traditionally you may place them into the Washington Color School, right? But by just changing that language a bit in that section text, I was able to then talk about what are they doing outside of that, right? And so in the same way, I'm looking at Keith Morrison or Robert Hall, who are working within this kind of space of kind of abstract expressionist work, but they're also doing something a little bit different. So I think to your point is, I think there's a way you can play on the vernacular that you use and the language that you use in either like section titles or even in the way that you place the work or write about it in the label, that you talk about them within context and with outside of the context. And I think that's where things get really interesting, because I think there's so many artists even now that, have traditional and sometimes formal training, or there's artists that are working in traditional ways that they may unconsciously not know, right? And so sometimes I think it's really great to contextualize an artist that may think that they're working in a space that is outside of these kind of art canons and these historical moments or periods. But then there's other times where, artists are creating new language for what they're doing. And so I think that's that kind of, I wouldn't even say gray area, but that's that axis in which you can kind of have kind of artistic play and curation.
Yeah, and as you were saying a couple minutes ago, that all still needs to stem from not putting an artist's work in a context that feels disingenuous, right? And that requires you, if you have that in mind of like not being disingenuous, or as with writing critical papers in an English setting, not like being disingenuous about bringing the ideas of a given critical theory to a work that it may not actually mesh with because you want to say something. That requires a lot of time spent thinking about the person and their work to be genuine about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're alley-ooping me to talk about more things, right?
Yeah, I'm doing my job.
There's a section in the text. There's a Black feminist theorist. Her name is Tina Camp. She wrote a book called The Black Gaze. And there's a section of photos. And that section is called The Frequency of Images. And there's a chapter in her book called The Frequency of Black Life. And in simple terms, it's a quote that lives on the wall that says the frequency isn't what we see, but how we see, right? And so in that section of the show, there is this phenomenal photographer. His name was Robert Bobby Sinstack. And his family was connected to one of the oldest publications, African-American publications in the U.S., called the Chicago Defender, which I believe was founded in 1905, right? And so he comes to Fisk to teach. And so in this section are all artists that were taught under Robert Bobby Sinstack at Fisk University, right? Between the late 60s, mid to late 70s, right? And the reason I bring that up is in one of his quotes, he talked about this idea of the image feeling like a motion picture, right? And then he had this philosophy that an artist who's still living, his name is John Simmons, who's in the show, talked about this idea of the ghost. And this idea of the ghost was this kind of intangible force that pulled you, that lived within the image, right? And so, to your point, here's this kind of way and kind of this artistic philosophy that these artists are working in under the tutelage of Robert Bobby Sinstack. And so now when I'm looking at this contemporary text by Tina Camp, where she's talking about the idea and the frequency of images and how images have these sonic dimensions, and I'm like, wow, this actually gives language and gives context to allow the audience to look at this photography, not just for its visual qualities, but think about its sonic qualities, think about the movement in the images. And so that was a kind of a really particular way within the exhibition where, to your point, right, I was able to take this kind of artistic theory or this philosophy by Tina Camp and pair it with the photography of these phenomenal artists, Michael Atkins, George Walker III, Johnny Simmons, and Bobby Sinstack. But it's really kind of that phrase that she says within her book is not what you see, but how you see. And so that really was like how the frequency of images informs it. In that section, I have an audio scan portion where I ask the audience to say, when you look at this image, what do you hear? Right? What do you hear? Right? What do you think the next movement in this image is? And I learned that, right, an exhibition becomes an environment in which you can inspire your audience to think about things in new ways. And so going back to kind of to land the plane a bit where you were talking about this idea of these sort of philosophies or these ideas and these concepts. That was a perfect example of this work was created way before this text or even this kind of phrase was designed. But in many ways, I felt like they complemented one another. And by going to this section and seeing the section titled The Frequency of Images, it would already alert you to think about imaging and image making in a different way. And particularly think about how you look at the images of those in everyday Black life and communities in a different way. And so that's just kind of one of those kind of unique ways where I get to marry this idea of kind of this academic scholarship that this kind of nuance and contemporary scholarship that I'm finding, and pairing that with work that was created as early as the 60s and the late 70s.
So shifting gears slightly.
Yeah.
There's a video on the Frist YouTube channel of, I assume which one I'm talking about, of you showing your father around some stuff from the Southern Modern exhibit last year. And in that video, you talked to him about how it felt like you kind of grew up in a museum.
Yeah.
What sort of work was your family like collecting and displaying that it felt like that?
Man, thank you for that question. So it's funny, man, because, and I don't know if you navigate this through your life, but some things you run away from, you come back to, right? So when I was a kid, my dad is really big into antiques, right? My dad is most kids went to stores. We went to the thrift store every week. We went to African art dealers. And so my dad had everything from African art in our home to antiques. And when my friends would come over, which that was very rare, my dad wasn't big on company, people were like, man, your house is like a museum, because they couldn't touch anything, right? It's like, I can't touch anything. And so it was interesting because I didn't understand that for me, when people always ask me about collecting art, I'm always advocating for, it's something powerful about as a child to grow up like around art, because it normalizes you to these spaces, right? I think sometimes when people go to museums and they're uncomfortable, they don't sometimes know how to behave inside a museum. It's like, how do I look at the art? How do I hold my hands? How do I put my hands behind my back? And one of the beautiful things I think that my dad offered me was growing up in a house with art. The first thing I ever broke was art. I remember distinctly, Dad, I hope you don't listen to this. It was an African figure. I forget the exact origin of the work. And I broke it and I tried to super glue it back together, right? And I did a great job, right? And I'm really big into conservation. Maybe that's why I like conservation now. But what that did for me was it made art feel accessible. And so in particular, I'm from Houston, and John Biggers was an artist who started the art department at Texas Southern in Houston. And particularly, his work was well known in the area that I lived in. Like he lived down the street from where I grew up. And so I would see his work all the time in my home, which is the piece that I brought to the museum, is a piece I grew up with. But also I would see his beautiful murals when I would go to different venues in Houston. And so I think I said one time in an interview that one of the reasons I think I became a curator was I wanted to recreate my dad's home, but invite all my friends in, right? And so my dad had all of these amazing artifacts and still does in his home, but only a handful of people could come into my house, right? But now at a museum at the Frist, right, we can bring art of the world and everybody. We want everybody to come in and see the work, right? So it's like, here's a place where you can be extremely curious, and there's ownership. Once you pass the admission of coming to the museum, there's this moment where you get to live and be with the work, if it's only for 30 minutes or an hour, but that really, I think, can have a transformative power on you. And so I always go back to the first museum I ever understood was my living room, was my home, right? And I think that's what makes me so comfortable with art, but also that's what makes me understand the power of art being in your proximity. And being not only just living with art, but just being able to like indulge in the visual stimulus of kind of and seeing that art and what that does to you.
Yeah. Different but similar is I grew up going to a lot of like comic book conventions.
Yeah.
So obviously, its own form of art that should be respected in its own way, despite being different than the stuff we've been talking about. But same thing of like, there was always a lot of like very comic booky or fantasy art hanging in my parents' home, and going to these conventions with artist alleys where it's like, it became very apparent in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise if I hadn't gone to these conventions, that like, oh, this person wrote and drew this book, and I'm looking at the person who drew the thing, and they just went to Kinko's and printed it off and stapled it, and now it's here. Like, it's removing that barrier of getting something off the wall at the comic shop, because here's the person who did it.
You know, it's so crazy you say that. I would say 80% of artists, certainly older artists that I've worked with, their first introduction to art was through comic books, right? And they would tell me, like, man, Mike, I remember having, I think of this classic scene where you had a comic book under your bed, you're supposed to be asleep, but you have your flashlight. And so I think what you're saying really is this art that is, what I think a comic book is and has been is, one, you have strong narration, right? So you're using this kind of visual language to tell these stories, these heroic stories, these villain stories, whatever it may be, right? But what's interesting about is the mobility of a comic book, right? You can take it under your bed. You can take it with you, to your friend's house. It becomes this kind of place of exchange. I think of two people looking at one comic book together, but then you think about the intimacy of looking at a comic book under your bed, or the intimacy of you're in an awkward situation somewhere socially and you open your comic book and it gives you kind of an entryway into another world. And so I think that's why, as a curator, I really love like catalogs and like gallery guides, like those things you could take home, because there's something about being able to take art or something of artistic nature into your private space.
Yeah.
Right? So I love museums, right? I love that you can like see the art, but I always tell people, go by the gift shop, take the gallery guide home with you, buy the catalog. A lot of artists, particularly African-American artists, talks about how, their first time seeing art wasn't in the museum. It was in a book, right? It was this Henry Ossawa Tanner painting that they saw. It was this Aaron Douglas illustration they saw on the front cover of Opportunity or Crisis magazine. So it's like, I think you really are touching on something is comic books, I think, represent this accessibility of how art can be. And then there's this very tactile aspect of it, right? As much as I would love it, I wish there was more art that people could touch. Sure. Right? But there's something really powerful when you can kind of like, dog ear a page on your comic book. And you remember, right? I would imagine, right? And I guess I'll pose this question to you. Were there any kind of comic books that were kind of like you read them a million times, but they offered you a kind of space of solace? Like you revisited a certain comic book or maybe a certain character more than once?
I'm not a huge rereader, but to your point...
Okay.
But to your point, there are certain, especially like long-standing comic book characters that their story gets told over and over again with slight variations.
Right.
The various iterations of Spider-Man or Batman films that keep happening. Or I usually think of like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with something like this, where it has by and large been the same story told every 5 to 10 years since the early 80s, and I just never get tired of it. Because it's always looking at different versions of the ideas of like family, or how much you are your like DNA, or what you physically are versus what you choose to be or make yourself into be, and how those themes can be reworked in different contexts by different people at different times.
It's interesting when you think about certain moments, like, man, people are still interested in Batman when you understand the origin of how old Batman is, or Spider-Man. But you're right, like there's this nuance to these characters. And I think that really hits on the point of you get to follow, and it sometimes offers this level of escapism, right? You get to go into this narrative. You're rooting for, whatever character you're rooting for. And a part of the exhibition, Kindred Spirits, the intergenerational part. A comic book you love, your dad or your mom could have loved, right? A character that you remember, right? In the new iteration of what that character is, maybe something totally different, but there's still this kind of through line that connects them. And so that's what I'm always kind of looking for in art, too, when I'm curating, is when we're thinking about intergenerational forms of expression with Kindred Spirits in that title, was like, I want to imagine someone who was 70 years old standing next to a painting with someone who was 6 years old. and they see something really extraordinary in the work, and then it creates a dialogue, right? And then what does that dialogue look like? So what does it look like when you talk to someone who read a Spider-Man iteration from 20 or 30 years ago, and you've read a new edition, you know, something else new? Like, I'm interested in what that conversation would be like. And so that's what I hope this exhibition does. But also, I just hope that any art show that I'm working on kind of creates these cross-generational conversations.
Yeah. And talking about sort of creating dialogue and just like fomenting thought in general, in that same YouTube video with your father, you talked about wanting to find ways to get people to engage with the work. And you were talking several minutes ago about how so many times when people enter, especially a museum space, there is this sort of feeling of restriction of like, what do I do? How do I interact with this? What do you do, and what have you seen others in your field do to remove those barriers, to allow for easier engagement?
So one, man, it's something that we added for the iteration at the Frist Museum, is there's oral kind of what we call kind of like stops. And so each of the stops, I have a prompting question. So there's this game I love to play that I was taught when I was doing this program in conservation. And the game is called Love It, Hate It, Take It Home. And they had us go into it. It was in this museum. We were at Yale. And I don't say hate it because I hate to say hate it, but I would say love it, don't get it, take it home.
Like, not for me.
Not for me, right? Yeah, love it, not for me, take it home, right? But what was so powerful about it was those simple questions really created dialogue. When people came back, they were like, so it's really interesting, right? You may love an artwork, but you don't want to live with it.
Sure.
Right? And then you may not get an artwork, but you don't necessarily hate it. And what I found was one of the ways to kind of embrace the barriers is I think people sometimes, in conversations I've had with kind of guests in museums and galleries, think there's a certain way to like do art. How do I look at art? How do I go to a museum? How do I quiet? Do I say comments? And so what I found was, as an icebreaker in galleries, is I asked those questions. And so with this exhibition, I actually posed a question to you, right? It's in one of the sections. It's in a section called Schools of Color and Abstract Expressions. So I'm like, okay, this is a section with abstract work, right? So the question I asked when you scan that section is, how would you describe your life using 2 colors and 2 textures?
Oh, wow.
Right? And what that does is that it kind of reorients you to stop thinking around having to know what the artwork is about, and now to think about your own personal narrative. And not just your own personal narrative, but how do you talk about that in a different way? If I say, how was your day? You might say, my day is fine. You almost have an automated response because that's something you ask. But if I were to say, hey, man, how would you describe your day today in a color and 1 texture? So I'm going to pose it to you.
Yeah.
How would you, if you had to, from this morning, let's say from 8 a.m. this morning to it is 1:10, what would be the color and what would be the texture?
My gut reaction for color was kind of a blue-green.
Okay.
And I'm having a difficult time removing myself from like the textures on my body currently.
Yeah.
But like I'm wearing a shirt for the benefit of the audience. And it's a shirt that I actually helped my spouse make. Like we made this together out of an old curtain.
Wow.
So it's a pleasingly rough shirt, I would say. So I'm combining the blue-green color with a like just rough enough fabric texture.
I love that, right? Now think about it. In that moment, it made you have to really think about the interior texture of how you felt, right? And so in doing that prompt in the museum, I'm trying to put them in the mindset of how an artist would think about a painting that they're creating. Because what they're doing is translating some type of emotion, some type of idea to the canvas, and they're applying it with a certain type of brush to create these certain textures, and they're using particular colors to invoke or to create a certain message. And so going back to your original question is, how do you kind of like, as a curator, what are my tools? Is posing those type of questions.
Yeah.
Is how do you pose questions to your audience when they're in the museum, that at the end of that, I tell people at the end of that prompt, it says, if you're with somebody in the museum, explore and ask them the question and share what your answers are. So now you're in the middle of the museum, you're looking at these abstract paintings, right? And now you're telling your friend, man, my color was this, my color was that. And y'all may start a dialogue about why you picked those colors and textures. I just found out you and your spouse, now I know a little bit even more about your personal life because you had to use that as a way to talk about it. And that's exactly what I'm learning is, right? Like the interpretive power of asking people questions, the ways that you can pique people's curiosity while they're in museums, make it more participatory, actually, I feel, disarms them to feel like they have to perform a certain way where they're in the space.
Yeah. And particularly, I feel like that's a really useful exercise to employ with something like expressionist work, where often I feel like a lot of people have more difficulty engaging, even though I usually personally really gravitate toward abstract expressionist type work because at least for me, it's just asking me how I feel about the thing that is being presented to me. Like what emotion is hitting me. Like there is such an artifice removed from expressionism of understanding the actual visual symbology of what's happening or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. And so and so to your point, I want to turn that to the person, right? So now it's like, what colors do I feel in my life, right? What textures do I think about in my life? And then once you answer that, I think you could look back at the painting with a new lens and say, wow, I wonder what they were feeling. So now let me read this label and learn about their life. You see a piece by Keith Morrison where he's using these symbols and this abstraction, but then you find out he is of Jamaican origins, and then you start to see why these vibrant colors are being used when he's talking about pulling from these colors from the Caribbean, right? And now you're like, oh, I get these things. When you look at Alma Thomas's work, and she talks about how she had this infatuation and love with nature, right? And you start to understand how she's pulling from nature, but also she was, fascinated with, the Apollo, with spaceships in space, right? Now you're understanding, oh, this is kind of maybe what informs her work. You look at, Kenneth Victor Young, and he's using these kind of beautiful bands of color, and he talks about how he's inspired by jazz music, and most of his titles of his artwork are based off of jazz songs. Then you start to get a rhythmic feel to be like, I may not know the reason he's using these colors, but I can start to see the gestural movements in the painting that feel like a jazz song or a jazz composition, right? And so that's where, that's where I feel like the label, when you read a label at a museum or a gallery or wherever you are, it should enhance the way you look at the work, right? It should give you some insights about the work that actually inform you. So in that moment where you may feel miseducated of how to approach this work, it now gives you some language or some history around the person, either biographically or particularly of that work, that allows you to kind of be more comfortable with what you're viewing.
Yeah. Talking about museum labels and removing of barriers, I went to, I think it's the Hunter in Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And they had this really neat thing where one of the back wings of the museum, I think it was some of their permanent collection stuff.
Yeah.
They had taken some space out on the walls to point out, here is the anatomy of a museum wall plaque of here's what all these numbers mean, because was it the year it was made or the year that it entered the museum's collection or what number it is. And I really liked that sort of removing of barrier. Are there any museums that you've been to that you feel like are sort of unsung heroes, both either in their collection or the way that they have allowed their audience to engage with the art? Because I'm starting to try and collect a Rolodex of museums that are not the big ones in any given major city that are good to go to.
Yes, in New Orleans. So I'm working on a show that's opening in October called African Masquerades, and there's a museum called Backstreet, and it deals with kind of the masquerading culture of Black Indian masking in New Orleans, which you'll see Mardi Gras. But what's interesting about it was there's a young lady who runs it. Her father ran it before. He's now transitioned, and all of these kind of individuals that work within the masquerading tradition would donate their suits to this gentleman to have in his museum. And they have these beautiful like iPad labels that kind of tell the stories, but they're told through the lens of the makers. And so I really love artist labels a lot because there's an intimacy and there's this kind of insight that I think that is just so impactful. But the museum is small, right? But it's the way that she talks about the different objects and works in it, and the way that they're oriented that allow this kind of shrine-like atmosphere. But there's this kind of technological advancements because you can kind of read about the origin stories of it. And so that was, to me, was when I was going to New Orleans, I was going to these different, major institutions. I'm at NOMA where the show was, kind of starting from. But I was like, man, this everyone in the community was like, you got to go to Backstreet Museum. You have to go to this space. And when I went there, it was this magical place that probably was no larger than 2,500 square feet. But I left there really feeling like I understood the masquerade tradition from New Orleans in a different way, because not only was she someone who used to mask earlier in her life and used to do like the beadwork and create her own suits, but she's given this beautiful oral tradition and bringing other people up to talk about their stories. And so when I left, I was like, oh man, I really love to get to the meat of what I'm saying is like, I love these immersive experiences. I love when you can create these kind of quaint, intimate spaces that you almost feel alone, but in a public space.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think big museums, for all the size and beauty of them, can sometimes not give you that intimacy that you want with the object or with the artwork that makes you feel like that comic book that you had back when you were at home, you know?
Another, talking about like quaint, intimate spaces, another like unsung hero museum for me. I was very briefly, just like for one day in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a family funeral. And it was one of those things where like, okay, well, my Frist membership gets me into a museum that's here in town via the reciprocal benefits. So it's like, well, that's something to do because we don't know what else to do in Tulsa. And so we went to this museum called the Philbrook.
Okay.
And it is now one of my favorite museums I've been to. And it's this like sprawling Southwestern style home that some really rich people had made in like the 1920s. And then they decided their house was too big, so they built a smaller one across town and said, well, the old house is a museum now. But the museum has really leaned into the fact that it was a home and turned a lot of the smaller rooms into sitting rooms with like very period accurate furniture and like a phonograph playing period accurate music. But then the art on the wall is deeply modern. So you'd be on like a 1920s style couch looking at this enormous painting of a man in Nikes and a tracksuit on a horse holding a saber. Or like, because it's Tulsa and there's a significant Native American population in all of Oklahoma, obviously. There was a lot of like very modern Native American art being juxtaposed inside this house built by rich white people in the 1920s. And that sort of juxtaposition really stuck with me.
Yeah, man. I'm pretty sure that artist you're talking about is probably Kehinde Wiley, the on the horse.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, because he's really known for kind of taking these African American figures and putting them into these kind of Renaissance painting styles. Yeah. And it's like, so I would imagine that maybe was Kehinde. But yeah, I think you said something I think that's important. There's power in juxtaposition, right? There's power. And it's a book, man, that I love called Palace for the People. It's I forget the author, but it's like a love letter to libraries. So when people always ask me, and I always love to say this, and I think it's important to say it now, is what is my actual favorite institution? Is libraries, right? And I say that because when I was in high school, I moved to like a predominantly white neighborhood my last 2 years of high school, and one of the safest spaces I felt was in the library. And when you would go in the library, I remember distinctly, you would get this little strip of paper that would give you an hour time on the computer. But I remember librarians to me being almost like these kind of magical people, because I could throw anything at them. In those 2 years, I would go to the library, and I mean religiously. I went there every day after school, and I would come home when the sun came down. And I would volunteer with these ladies at the library, and I remember like any curiosity that came to my mind, they would open me to a world of books that had it, right? And so I always think about, libraries as these beautiful reliquaries of just information. And I think they're the real unsung heroes, right? I think that, because libraries have so much of the primary resource that supports what curators do, certainly special collections. We're doing these deep researches in special collections, and then we're able to then exhibit it and kind of display it and sometimes reproduce it in ways that, these kind of beautiful, sexy museums can do. But like, to me, libraries are just where it is. And when you think about institutionally, they outdate museums, right? They are kind of the OGs when you think about these institutions. And so libraries to me are just this place where you can bring any curiosity and there's something for you, right? Any subject, there's something for you. And you can go to that same place with a very different mindset and still find something for you. And I think that is just something that I think is really kind of magical about libraries. And so even when I was coming here to interview with you today, I still get that feeling when I walk into libraries because to me, books are literally like these. I look at books as kind of like these mystical objects that are waiting to tell you something. They're like, read me. Like, what I have pages among pages of information that I want to give to you. You just have to open me up. Right. And so I really think that like it's so appropriate. I'm so thankful to be invited today, but to have this conversation in the library, because to me, this is kind of where it all began for me, where my deepest curiosity would be kind of fulfilled was when I would go to the library in high school every day after school. And when I got off the computer, I would go look up a random book that I was interested in that particular day or that particular month. And I could take that, like the comic book, I could take it back home and I could spend time with it, right? And then I could go back to it later. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just like an art piece on a wall, like that's the way we connect with that person. We connect with these people via the words they've left us.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. They've left it there for you, right? And it's unchanging, right? Like, the internet, you could put an article up and you can't find the article. This probably happened to you. You like, man, this article I love, can't find this page anymore. But that book is there, right? And that book and a book never changes, but you change. I don't know if you've ever, it's kind of like music. I remember there's certain, I didn't get jazz at a certain point in my life. Certain musicians like John Coltrane was really hard to listen to when I was younger. And now that I'm able to like really listen with a different type of ear and experience, it's like the palette of my ear can hear it in a different way. And it's like the exact same song. Nothing changed from the song, but so much changed from me. And so that's also why I love art, is that when people come to a museum and they see artwork, I love when art, people are like, man, I knew this artist, or I get this art now. Like, that's always the most beautiful part as a curator, when you see somebody in front of a painting, in front of artwork, and you could tell something is like a light bulb is going off, and that there is something that is happening, and there's a memory that's being cemented at that very moment.
So as with any exhibits that come through the Frist, there are various programs and talks associated with them. What do we have going on with your work?
So it's, we were talking before about the frequency of images. And so actually May the 1st, that Thursday, we're having Johnny Simmons, Michael Atkins, and George Walker III, three of the photographers in the section. They're going to do a talk around their photography. And so I'm really excited about it because, we get to talk about the frequency of images, but really they're going to talk about the legacy of working with Bobby Sinstag, who's now transitioned, but was a mentor to all of them, but also so many other mentors. So in the show, there's just this kind of cross-pollination of people that people work with that's really great. And so I think that's a program that people really enjoy because, sometimes when you have a talk, you're talking about the general show. This talk will really be talking about a specific section of the show, and particularly photography, which I think, some people look at photography from a kind of a fine art lens, and then it's a very like documentary, kind of medium of like documenting life, right? And so I thought that would be a really great section to kind of hone in on. So that program will happen in May, and I think it would be a really great time for people to see the show because the show doesn't end until June the 1st.
Awesome. Yeah, and obviously there will be links to these exhibits and the Frist's website in the description of this podcast. But he also mentioned you wanted to talk about Project Uplift.
Yeah, so other programs I'm excited about is we were talking about earlier, like entryway into people getting into museums. And so we have a project called Project Uplift. And what it is, what one of the first things I took on as associate curator was I graduated from a historically black college, Fisk University, we talked about before. And I thought about this idea because the project was happening. Goes, man, what would have happened if I would have had a direct connection with a project with a museum in my undergraduate years? And so Project Uplift, it is a partnership with Tennessee State University with their design department. It is a partnership with Fisk University with their art department, and particularly the class Arts and Ideas, which was the class that got me started in my curatorial career. And so now what we're doing is in the fall semester, the Arts and Ideas class, students can pitch. They got to pitch an idea. Myself and Lakeisha Calvin, who's the chair of the art department, kind of create a short list of artists. They got to pitch an idea of a curated show with a local BIPOC artist. And then at the design department at TSU, we worked with Eric Jackson, who's a professor there, and they had to pitch a design concept. So we, myself, Eric, and my colleague Madeline, who works at the Frist Museum, were able to kind of put out a title for an exhibition. They had to create a design treatment for it. So I said that to say is it all comes together that now the top 5 candidates that applied or that pitched, the finalists got to pitch at the Frist. And so April the 10th, that show opens. And so this year we have Gopal, who is a student at Fisk University. We have Miles Jones, who's a student at Tennessee State University. And then you have Dominique Coleman, who goes by Unique, who's the artist. And so this will be an activation of the elevator that takes you from the ground floor to the top. So they'll have the landing. And so just something I think is really, really great when we talked about this idea of how do people transition into museums and have the access to it. And so it's a project I'm really excited about that past colleagues started, Brandy Coates and Danielle Myers, really kind of spearheaded it. And they're no longer with the museum, but the legacy of this project that was their brainchild has evolved into something I think that they will really be excited and proud of. And so I think it's always great when you can create projects at the institutions that you work at that directly connect to part of your trajectory and also ways that can bridge ways for people to kind of be more connected to the museum world.
Yeah, and I always really enjoy the way that the Frist uses its space. Like, think not too many years ago now, the first time that they used that elevator space as a sort of micro gallery, especially as a place that doesn't have a permanent collection, utilizing its space as effectively as possible to show you as much as possible, and especially how often it's local people, with the community gallery as you enter the building.
So yeah, I think the Conte Gallery, which you're speaking about, which is also accessible to people, even if you don't buy admission. For those who don't know, the museum is free for anyone 18 and younger, which is really great for people to know. And then this project, which is kind of targeting college students, is free. College night is every Thursday night, which is tonight. So hopefully when it's aired, maybe it's close to a Thursday. So if you're a college student, after 5:00 up until 8:00, you get free admission into the museum. And so a part of what Project Uplift was, kind of designed to do was also kind of a way where I would love to come to the museum on a Thursday night and just see college students hanging out, man. Just like, going to exhibits. We have the Grilled Cheesery who who navigates the cafe, and just bring your computer, hang out, see art, make that be a really kind of comfortable space. And kind of what we were talking about before as a kid growing up with art. I would love to see, we have different lounge areas and spaces where people can hang out and kind of sit and bring their computer and do things. It's like, I would love to, I think a great vision would, just to see just students see a museum as a place that's welcoming for them and a place that they can hang out, or a place for date night, or, it's a cheap date. You come there for free. I see some art, maybe just get some dinner afterwards. And so I'm really excited about just any possibility, the museum, the Frist, we're really excited about any ways to grant more access to our general public.
Thanks for coming on, and I appreciate the love for the library. The Frist is one of my favorite places in town, so we can have some reciprocal love.
Yeah, that's it.
And thank you all so very much for listening. As always, this podcast is brought to you because of the Nashville Public Library. So, wherever you are in Nashville or beyond, find your public library, get a library card, and use it. Because the best way to support your library is to let it support you with all the goods and services that they offer. I bet there's more than you think. Thanks so much.